It was the kind of night that made the bones ache. The wind blew like it had lost its mind, and the streets were empty, frozen under a thick veil of silence. In a forgotten corner of the city stood an old, crumbling orphanage, its windows frosted over, its roof leaking from years of neglect. Inside, children huddled together for warmth, but none as alone as Tafar. I was a small black boy, just 11 years old, with big eyes full of quiet strength. He had no memories of a mother's embrace, no bedtime stories from a father, no photos of family hanging on the wall. All he had was his name and a thin blanket, faded, torn, but his only source of warmth and comfort. He never complained, never cried. He had grown used to hunger, used to the cold, used to waiting for something that never came. That night, the power went out. Darkness swallowed the hallways of the orphanage. The other children clung to each other under shared sheets, but Tafari chose silence. He stepped away from the crowded room, walking barefoot across the icy floor. He looked out through a broken window, and that's when he saw him. Across the street, curled up on a bench, was a man, an old black man, hunched and motionless. Snow gathered on his shoulders, and his clothes looked like they had battled one. Too many winters. His breath was shallow, his skin pale. He looked more like a shadow than a man. But something about him pulled at Tafari's heart. Without hesitation, Tafari turned around, walked to his bed, and grabbed the only blanket he had. It was thin, barely enough for himself, but it was all he could offer. With slow, careful steps, he opened the creaking front door and stepped out into the freezing night. Each gust of wind cut through his thin clothes like knives. His feet went numb. His fingers trembled. But he didn't stop. Tafari walked across the street, stood before the sleeping stranger, and with small, trembling hands wrapped the blanket over the man's shoulders. The old man didn't move. He didn't speak. But a faint sigh left his lips' warmth. Even the smallest drop had found him. Tafar. I stood there for a while, shivering in silence. He didn't know why he did it. He didn't know that this man, this broken soul, was his real father. The man who had searched for years, lost everything, and ended up forgotten by the world. Now wrapped in the blanket of his own son. As Tafari turned back toward the orphanage, his tiny frame vanishing into the night, the snow continued to fall, silent, gentle, hiding the truth that fate had just reunited two hearts, if only for a moment, but the night was far from over. Morning came slowly. The sun rose pale and distant, hidden behind gray clouds that held back another snowstorm. The city began to stir again. Cars crawled across icy roads, and steam rose from sewer grates like silent whispers of forgotten pain. But inside the orphanage, nothing changed. The walls still creaked. The air was still cold. And Tafari still had no blanket. He sat alone on the edge of his bed, arms wrapped around himself, teeth chattering. The matron of the orphanage passed by and scolded him for losing his only possession. No one knew where it had gone, and Tafari didn't say a word. He didn't explain, didn't ask for another. He simply endured. It was what he had always done. Across the street, the old man stirred beneath the worn blanket. His eyelids fluttered open and his fingers clutched the fabric tightly, as if it were the only thing tethering him to life. His memory was clouded, his body numb, but in the folds of that blanket, something stirred, a scent, a warmth, a feeling that was hauntingly familiar. For years, he had roamed the streets nameless, broken by loss and guilt. He had once been a man with dreams, a father who held his infant son with trembling joy. But poverty stole everything. His wife vanished into the system. His baby, his only child, was taken away when he could no longer feed him. No one listened. No one cared. He searched for years, until the world swallowed him in silence. Now, wrapped in this thin cloth, his mind replayed a memory, a hospital room. A newborn wrapped in a soft blanket, blue and white. stitched with a tiny name on the corner. The name was blurred in his mind, but the warmth was the same. It couldn't be real. It had to be the cold playing tricks on him. Back in the orphanage, Tafari stared through the window again. His breath fogged the glass. The man was still there. Alive. There was no pride in his heart, only a pull, an invisible thread that connected him to the stranger. Tafari didn't know why, but something deep inside him refused to look away. Later that day, as snow began to fall again, the man stood up slowly, the blanket still draped over his shoulders. He limped toward the alley nearby, clutching his chest as he coughed. A pain shot through him, sharp and heavy. His strength was leaving him, but just before he disappeared around the corner, he looked back toward the orphanage. Their eyes met, only for a second. But in that single second, the old man saw something he hadn't seen in years. A familiar face. A face that looked just like his own when he was young. The alley was narrow and silent. Trash bins lined the walls, and icicles hung like knives from broken gutters. The old man, his steps slow and uneven, made his way behind a dumpster, where he collapsed onto a torn board sheet. His breathing was shallow, chest rattling with every exhale. The blanket wrapped around him like a second skin, a thin barrier between life and death. But his mind refused to rest. That boy's eyes, they weren't just familiar, they were his. Not just in color or shape, but in something deeper, something that memory could not fully explain. It wasn't the first time he had seen a face like that. Years ago, in the final moments before child services tore his baby from his arms, he had memorized it. A baby with deep brown eyes and a quiet sadness, as if the child already knew the world would not be kind. And now, so many winters later, he had seen it again. Tafari returned to his duties inside the orphanage. He swept the floor, washed dishes, folded torn clothes, all while his body trembled from the cold. The other boys teased him for being careless with his blanket. The matron didn't offer a new one. No one asked why he had done it. But Tafari didn't regret it. Deep in his chest, something told him that the man needed it more. That night, as the children slept and the wind howled louder than before, Tafari lay curled on his mattress, arms holding his thin shirt close to his chest. His eyes refused to close. The old man's face haunted his mind, not because it was scary, but because it was sad. So deeply sad, like his own reflection in the mirror. He remembered a dream he had once of being held. Not in the orphanage. Not by the matron, but by arms that felt strong and warm. He could never see the face clearly, but the feeling was always there. Safety, love, and a name. Tafari. He had never questioned where his name came from. It was written on a tag around his neck when the police found him as a baby. No birth certificate, no last name. Just Tafari. But now something shifted. In the alley, the old man whispered that name in his sleep. Tafari. As if it had lived inside his heart for 11 long years. The next morning, Tafari left early before the others woke. His fingers were stiff, his body weak, but his heart burned with a quiet determination. He didn't know why, but he had to see the man again. He crossed the street slowly, feet crunching in the snow. The bench was empty. Panic bloomed in his chest. His eyes scanned the alleyways, the dumpsters, the shadows, and then he saw it. A corner of the blanket, his blanket, just visible behind the trash bins. He ran toward it, and what he saw made him stop in his tracks. Tafari stood frozen. The alley smelled of rust and old decay, but that was not what made his heart race. It was the sight before him, the old man lying on his side, motionless, with snowflakes gathering in his hair and breath barely visible. In the cold air, the blanket Tafari had given him was wrapped tightly around his chest, as if he were holding on to more than warmth. As if he were holding on to the last thread of life. Tafari approached slowly. Every step felt heavier than the last. He knelt beside the man, unsure of what to do. The man's eyes were closed, and his lips were blue, cracked from cold and time. Tafari reached out a hand, trembling, and gently touched the man's shoulder. The man stirred. A soft groan escaped his lips as he opened his eyes halfway. And in that moment, just for a breath, they stared at each other again. Closer this time. Eye to eye, soul to soul. The man blinked, confused, then reached for the boy's face with a shaking hand. His fingers stopped mid-air, hovering, then gently brushed the boy's cheek. That touch, it wasn't just cold skin against cold skin. It was memory. It was longing. It was something ancient and broken trying to rise again. Tafari noticed something. A scar, small, barely visible on the man's collarbone. It was shaped like a crescent. For most, it would have meant nothing. But Tafari knew that scar. He had seen it before. In a faded dream, or maybe in the mirror of his own skin. Because he had one too. The same shape. The same spot. A birthmark, his matron had once said. But this was not coincidence. He touched his own collarbone, then looked back at the man. His heart pounded, chest rising and falling with a sudden wave of confusion, wonder, and fear. Man tried to speak. His lips moved, but the words were weak and broken. Still, one word came out. Faint. Soft. Fragile. Tafari. The boy's name. Spoken. Not like a stranger, but like someone who had whispered it for years in his sleep. Someone who had lost it, and never stopped hoping to say it again. The boy stood up. His eyes wet. He didn't know what to do. He wanted to run, to scream, to hug the man, to ask questions he didn't even know how to form. But the moment was too big, and the air was too cold. He looked around. No one was nearby. He had to act, with trembling urgency. Tafari ran back across the street, into the orphanage, shouting for help. For the first time in years, he let his voice rise. For the first time in his life, someone heard his cry. Back in the alley, the man closed his eyes again. Not in death, but in surrender. Not to the cold, but to the hope he thought had died long ago. The ambulance came slower than Tafari hoped, but it came. Sirens cut through the frozen air as neighbors peeked from behind their windows, wondering why an orphan boy stood in the alley, sobbing into his hands. The old man was lifted carefully onto a stretcher, oxygen placed over his mouth, his frail body wrapped tighter in that old blanket, the same one Tafari had once clung to on lonely nights. The paramedics asked questions. Who was he? What happened? Was he family? Tafari couldn't answer. He didn't have the words. He didn't even know if what he felt was real, or just a dream woven from hunger and cold. At the hospital, the old man was treated as a John Doe. No identification. No next of kin. No insurance. Just a ghost of a man with a heartbeat and a name no one knew except Tafari. Back at the orphanage, the matron scolded Tafari for running off, but something in her tone had changed. Maybe it was the boy's eyes, or maybe it was the way he clutched. His chest, like his whole world, had cracked open. For once, she didn't send him to bed without food. Later that night, Tafari snuck into the old records room. It was a place he had never entered before dark, filled with dust and forgotten papers. But tonight, something pulled him there. He dug through boxes marked with children's names, adoption files, and intake sheets from years past. And then he found it, a folder, yellowed, fragile, on the front. The name, Tafari, in capital letters. Faded ink. He opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a single page. A handwritten note from the police station dated 11 years ago. The note described how a baby boy was found crying alone outside a shelter, wrapped in a hospital blanket with the name Tafari written in permanent marker. No one came forward. No one claimed him. But at the bottom of the page, scribbled in different handwriting, was something else. Possible father, Joseph N. Seen outside shelter the night before. No ID. Mental distress. Disappeared before questioning. Tafari's hands trembled. Joseph N. His breath caught in his throat. His legs felt weak. Could it be? The man in the alley. The man who said his name. The scar. The eyes. The broken voice that sounded like a memory. He ran from the room, holding the file close to his chest. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't tell anyone. He just ran through the night, through the snow, all the way to the hospital. The building stood quiet under the dim orange glow of street lamps. Inside, the nurse at the counter looked up, surprised to see a child in the waiting room. Tafari pushed the folder onto the desk and pointed toward the emergency ward. His lips didn't form words, but his eyes begged. The nurse opened the folder, read the paper, and her face changed. Something shifted. She stood up quickly and disappeared. Through the double doors. And for a moment, all Tafari could do was sit alone, waiting. The hospital walls were quiet, painted in pale colors that tried to comfort, but never could. Time moved slowly there, like each minute weighed heavier than the last. Tafari sat on the cold plastic bench, legs swinging just above the floor. The crumpled file still clutched in his arms. He didn't move. He barely blinked. The only thing that moved was his chest up and down, with breaths he didn't know he was holding. Minutes passed. Then footsteps. The nurse returned, no longer with confusion in her face, but something deeper: concern, and perhaps disbelief. She motioned for Tafari to follow her. Through the double doors they walked, past long halls and quiet rooms, until finally they reached the end of a corridor. Room 214. The door was slightly open. Inside, the old man lay still, surrounded by machines that whispered softly in steady beeps. His chest rose with each breath, weak but steady. A doctor stood beside him, writing notes, and when he saw the boy, he nodded quietly, no questions, no resistance, as if somehow they all understood that this boy belonged here. Tafari stepped closer. The blanket he had once given now covered the man's legs. His face looked softer in the light, less haunted, but still marked by years of struggle. His eyes remained closed. The boy reached out and placed the file on the bedside table. Then he stood still, silent, watching. He didn't need to say anything. His presence said enough. The room was filled not with words, but with something else, something heavier, more sacred. The space between them was no longer just air, but a memory waiting to return. Then the old man stirred. His eyelids fluttered. He turned his head slowly, eyes searching, unfocused, until they landed on Tafari. And in that moment, everything stopped. The boy, the man, the machines, the room. A breath passed between them. Recognition bloomed, not with certainty, not with logic, but with something deeper than memory. The man's lips parted, and though his voice was only a whisper, it cracked the silence like thunder. Tafari, he said it again, not as a guess, not as a dream, but as a father who had spoken that name in his heart 1,000 times over 1,000. Empty nights. Tears filled Tafari's eyes. His body trembled. His heart didn't understand how or why, but his soul did. This was him. This was his father. The man reached out weakly, and Tafari stepped closer. Their hands met, small and soft, worn and weathered, and in that touch, years of pain melted. Like snow under the sun, but just as warmth began to fill the room. The machines beeped louder. The old man's eyes rolled slightly. His breathing became shallow. The nurse called for the doctor. The calm became chaos. And Tafari stood frozen, afraid that just as he had found what he never knew he was missing, he was about to lose it again. Alarms rang through the hospital room. Nurses rushed in. The doctor gave urgent instructions. Tubes were adjusted. Oxygen increased. The air was thick with tension, every second pressing against Tafari's chest like a heavy stone. He stood against the wall, unable to breathe, watching as the man who had whispered his name now seemed to be slipping away. But through the chaos, the old man's hand remained outstretched, reaching for something. Someone reaching for him. Tafari stepped forward, slowly, fearfully, but with something deeper guiding him, a pull not from the world around him, but from within. He reached out and took the old man's hand once more, and something happened. The beeping slowed. The tension in the room settled. The breath returned. The old man's body eased into a fragile calm, as if the presence of his son was medicine the machines could never give. His lips moved again, softer now, cracked by age and silence. A single tear rolled down his cheek. The nurses stepped back. The doctor gave a quiet nod and left the room. And so, it was just the two of them again. Tafari stood there, holding the hand of a man the world had forgotten, but whose blood ran in his veins. The man who had lost everything, yet still remembered the name of his child. The boy who had given up the only warmth he had, never knowing he was covering the shoulders of the one who had given him life. For the first time in years, Tafari didn't feel like an orphan. He felt like a son. In the days that followed, things began to change. The hospital social worker opened the file Tafari had brought. They found old records, blurry photos, and bits of truth long buried under red tape and dust. DNA tests confirmed what the heart already knew. Tafari wasn't nameless. He wasn't alone. He was the son of Joseph Nkrumah, a man who had wandered the streets in pain, never giving up hope, even when he had nothing left but breath. And now, he had found what he had lost. The city heard the story. Newspapers called it a miracle. But for Tafari, it was never about headlines. It was about a touch, a name, a moment beneath falling snow. Joseph recovered slowly, but every day, Tafari was there, beside his bed, holding his hand, bringing warmth not from a blanket, but from the heart of a boy who had chosen kindness without expecting anything in return. And when the doctors finally cleared him for release, he didn't walk out of the hospital alone. He walked with his son. Hand in hand, two souls once separated by time, pain, and silence, now whole again. And as they stepped out into the light of a new day, Tafari looked up at the man beside him, not a stranger, not a beggar, but his father. And in the quiet of that moment, Joseph whispered something again. Tafari, not as a cry this time, but as a promise.